Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about how you can write a good introduction for a scientific paper. Now, one of the key things when you're talking about a scientific paper is that first and foremost, you want your introduction to grab the reader's attention as quickly as possible because a lot of people have very short attention spans, and it's just kind of like there's no substitute for a good first impression. Similarly, with a paper, there's no good substitute for a good first couple of sentences. And so, this is an important thing to try and keep in mind when you're writing a good introduction. Along with this, one of the things you should always make sure to emphasize in your introduction is again, what am I studying and why should I care? This should be the biggest take home point for the introduction section to help set up the rest of the paper. I should know what I'm looking for and why on earth I should actually care about it. Now, in order to try and essentially keep the paper moving and keep the attention grab, you often need to try and keep your introduction section relatively short. So the good general rule is 2 to 3 paragraphs. If it's less than, if it's one paragraph, you just haven't provided enough information. If it's more than three, it's going to tend to drag a little bit. So we've got a short amount of room to try and accomplish several major tasks. So in this 2 to 3 paragraphs, you should actually try and complete the following tasks. First, make sure that you introduce the area of research. So this isn't just specifically what you're doing, but the broader field. So if I'm, say, studying the solubility of solids, I should try and focus on why the solubility of solids in general is important. However, the biggest thing is what the introduction should not be, which is just a description of the methods. So the methods being used do uh, do require acknowledgement, but the focus should always be on what's being studied. So unless you're actively studying a piece of equipment, try and de-emphasize, try not to make your area of research the actual method section, but instead what you're studying. Now, similarly, once you have an idea of what the broader field is and the broader context for what you're looking at is, then you need to actually kind of dive into what specific sub research area and topic you're looking at and why it's important and why you should care. And this often means making use of a lot of relevant work. So make sure uh, that the reader knows what the current state of the art is and what people know, so that you can essentially try and help advance this sort of work. Now, part of that is in order to emphasize the importance, you need to try and justify the need for the current work and how it differs from the preceding work. And this can be something such as you're studying a whole new compound. But oftentimes, especially with the sort of experiments we're working with this semester, it's often just looking at studying different conditions, maybe different temperatures or pressures than is typically reported in the literature. And there actually is a place for such basic kind of grunt work. So make sure that you emphasize what you're actually doing and how it might be different from what came before. And similarly, once you've identified a need, you need to actually take some time and summarize what you did and what sort of general findings you may have found. So, this is actually a lot of different tasks we're trying to accomplish, and often in a short amount of space. So, one of the best ways to try and go about this is to essentially streamline the procedure. And so, in order to do this, there's a fairly common general structure for how you can write an introduction. So, the classic advice is go from broad, the general, the general field you're studying, to narrow, what you've specifically done and why it matters. So, this can be broken up into three major moves or subs or sections. The first is essentially making sure you introduce the research area. So, first, you need to identify what the research area is and make sure that the reader knows what it is. Then, you need to establish why that research area is actually important. And then, what sort of background information the reader may need to know, such as what type of systems are being used, what's the current state of the art for methods being implemented. Essentially, just a good summary of the important or relevant details. Then the second section is often identifying what gaps are present in the research area, what isn't known, what assumptions have generally been made by previous work. And then the final section is often just filling in the gaps. So introducing what your current work is, how it differs from the previous work, and how it answers these gaps in the research area. And then usually a quick sentence or two previewing the key findings, what general trends you tended to find, and this will help the reader keep an eye out for keep out keep an eye out for the important results as you work through the paper. Now, some good tips about how you essentially organize this is each of these moves typically ends up becoming its own paragraph. And this will essentially help you streamline a topic for each of the three paragraphs. However, it's often not uncommon to either move section 2 into section 1, but much more commonly into section 3, where you will identify the gaps and fill in the gaps all in kind of one more condensed move. And this is actually fairly common when you're trying to essentially shorten or streamline a paper, such as if you're writing a such as if you are writing a communication instead of a general article. In addition, it's not uncommon for your introduction to make use of multiple voices. So, so you're often going to be using the present tense to emphasize what is known, but you're often going to be moving into the past, uh, into the past tense with active voice to emphasize what people have done. In general, again, we're trying to write in third person to distinguish what is generally known. But again, that first person tense can be important to indicate what specific authors have done, and often at the in the end of your third section, what you specifically have done in this work. And again, present tense are generally going to be used for things that are true, and past tense are for things that were done. Now, this is kind of a lot of general advice and not exactly a lot of specific context. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through, say, one of my favorite papers from Science in 2004, essentially that was crucial in determining the structure of photosystem 2, which essentially is uh, the part of chlorophyll that actually is responsible for, say, the reduction of oxygen and generating the energy to fix CO2. So you can see from the first sentence here that we have that the paper immediately identifies what the general topic of interest is. So photosynthesis and using that energy to fix CO2. And then it essentially spends the rest of the first chapter saying emphasizing why this is an important process. First of all, because it is very difficult, and second of all, because it's very useful. And so with these 2 points, it really helps the reader identify why I might care about photosystem 2, and then it starts by identifying what the general problem is. And that's that we need to try and figure out how it works. And that's kind of how it ends the first section. And then after the first, then as we move into the second section, we're essentially trying to identify the gaps. So this is, in this example, how we're trying to essentially identify the gaps in the research is also a little bit in summarizing what's already known. So they go into details about what approaches have been used before to determine the structure and essentially start emphasizing kind of the failings of these systems. And it's a little bit vague here, but essentially it's because the previous methods don't have exactly the greatest accuracy in positioning where all of the atoms are, as well as it has a tendency to, well, oxidize the surrounding residues. But again, you start to see the general gaps in the research. And then, as as indicated earlier, the third section or the third paragraph is much more about what they did. So here's what's previously been done. Here's kind of the failings of the model. And then here's what we did. And here's how it kind of differs from what was what came before. And then the last two sentences are essentially a nice summary of what was found and why it's important. So this gives you an idea of what you should be looking for in the rest of the paper. And again, if you're interested in going through the details of this paper, it will be provided on Blackboard. So next time, we're going to be talking about how we segue from the introductions to the methods. Till then, take care.